Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. It's me, the South African Wanderer, aka Pranesh, and this is the third and final part on the levers you can pull when exposing photographs manually in camera. The first part dealt with shutter speed and the effects of shutter speed on an image, and then the second part was aperture, in-depth look on aperture and what it means when you are using aperture to vary the exposure on an image. So this third part is going to be on the third lever, which is ISO or ISO. So to understand why it's called ISO, we have to go back to the history lessons I've been giving, but this one's not too far back. It actually goes back to film cameras and 1974. So once film had been invented and film cameras gained popularity, people began to play around with the sensitivity of film. And obviously more sensitive film would be better for lower light situations, and less sensitive film will be better for brighter situations. And up to 1974, how they measured the sensitivity of this film was different for different manufacturers. There were two main standards, ASA and DIN or DIN. And in 1974, both these standards were incorporated into a single international standard organization standard that was then the standard to measure sensitivity of film going forward. So International Standard Organization is then abbreviated to ISO, and the ISO rating of a film was then how sensitive a film was. ISO set a base rating of 100, and then if you double the base rating, you double the sort of brightness of the image that you get from a film. So if you had a film that was ISO 100 and then you changed it out for ISO 200, you could double the brightness of an image with that ISO 200 film. So, you know, back in the day, photographers would walk around with different sensitivity film, and then if they needed to, you know, suddenly shoot in low light situations, they'd have to pop out the roll of film that they had in their camera, put in the high sensitivity film, and then shoot again. Not very practical, because film being light sensitive means that you can't really be opening and closing out the back of that camera that often. But if you, for instance, were doing a concert at night or in a very low lit environment, you could get film that was going to be specific to that situation and shoot with it. When digital cameras came around, they adopted the same sort of brightness measure, let me call it. Digital camera sensors only really have one sensitivity. So the components that make up that sensor are sensitive to RGB light, and then that is read out electronically, and the manufacturers then matched the output to the film based ISO system that was already in place. So they matched the output brightness of their sensors to you know, either 100 or 200 ISO film, and that's how they developed their digital ISO settings. So one thing to bear in mind is that on a digital camera, the ISO setting, although it impacts brightness, is not really changing the sensitivity of the sensor itself, but how the light hitting the sensor is actually read and converted into a final image, let me say. So ISO does impact the brightness of an image, even though technically speaking, it's not bringing in any additional light into the camera, like shutter and aperture would. It's how the camera sensor is reading the light hitting it and converting that into an image. So I used the same figurine that we used for Aperture, the Stormtrooper, and I quickly ran up the ISO from my camera's base ISO of 100, then to 200, 400, 640, and 800, just to show you that increasing the ISO then also increases the exposure of an image, with the 800 ISO being almost overexposed. So while ISO doesn't fundamentally increase the amount of light or decrease the amount of light that's hitting your sensor, it can control brightness of an image. However, you'll be pretty hard pushed to find a dedicated ISO button on a photography camera to change the ISO up and down. Although some modern cameras now will give you that ability by being able to customize a dial that will then change up the ISO or change it down again. But typically speaking, most photographers will want to shoot at as low an ISO as possible, because one of the side effects of increasing ISO is it brings in what is termed as noise. So in the film days, this would translate into grain or graininess of an image. In modern digital sensors, this noise can show through as grain, but sometimes also shows through as color noise, so pixels with different color. And just to illustrate that effect of noise, you'll see that I shot the same image exposed with a 800 base ISO almost, and then increased the ISO to 4000 and 12,800. In processing these raw files, I won't adjust the noise reduction, so you can actually see how much noise is in the raw file straight out of camera, and how much noise difference there is between 4000 and 12,800 compared to the 800. So that then brings me into how do you use ISO in exposing a photo. I think I mentioned it earlier, but what you want to do is keep the base ISO as low as possible, and then adjust aperture and shutter speed according to what you need in the photo. So if you need, for instance, a faster shutter speed to freeze motion, for instance, a bird in flight flapping its wings, and you want to keep the shutter speed above 1/3200th of a second or 1/4000th of a second, sometimes shooting with your aperture fully open still results in an underexposed image. So what you would need to do is then pick up the ISO to a setting that then gives you the brightness you need in that image. I think one of the biggest questions then asked is, if you can digitally change the brightness of a image in post using Lightroom or Photoshop, why is it such a issue to get the ISO correct in the field, in camera? I think the advice I would always give is, because you can adjust the ISO and then see the impact of changing the ISO on the image while you're in the field, I would always advise to shoot with the correct ISO setting in the field already. So if you want to freeze action, for instance, and that's the example I'm giving, what you'll tend to do is, if you're not getting the exposure correct, is possibly adjust the shutter speed to actually then try and get that photo correctly exposed, and then you bring in motion blur and things like that into the image unnecessarily, while if you have the correct ISO setting, you can actually then shoot as close to as what you want the final result to be, actually. So shooting higher ISOs nowadays is much better, I would say, but there are some other issues as well. As much as you can reduce a lot of the noise produced in an image shooting at a higher ISO using programs such as DxO, and I've covered this in a separate video that I've done, and now Adobe Photoshop also does it. The other possible issue that you run into is that using higher ISO in body does actually erode your dynamic range of an image. So dynamic range is a measure of how much recovery almost you can do in the darkest parts of the image and in the brightest parts of the image, of detail in both those sort of tails of the spectrum. And shooting very high ISO then actually reduces the ability to push the ends of that envelope almost. And then there's also limitations to what programming can do, and shooting 12,800 or higher ISO, as much as your noise reduction can be used, it does still leave a lot of noise. And where that becomes important is not necessarily on social media posts or things like YouTube or Instagram, but if you were to then print images, you will not be able to print them as large because you will see the grain come through in those images. So yeah, I think that's a quick rundown of ISO and how it does affect brightness of an image, and how you should actually limit your ISO when shooting in the field. It's not the first lever to pull when you're out in the field. You either pull your levers of shutter speed or aperture, depending on what you're trying to achieve in the final image. And then ISO is almost used to balance out the image once you've pulled those two primary levers of aperture and shutter speed. So I think this is the last sort of tutorial in the series. What I would want to do is round it all off with a quick video on how you would go about using manual mode in your camera, and I'll possibly get out into the field and show you that. But what I would want to do is almost film the back of one camera with the other camera, so I may need to do it actually on the desktop, like we've done all the sample images in these videos. So I hope you did watch the other two videos as well, and this video then rounds up the series for you, and you've learned something from it. And I hope you have a little bit of a better understanding, so that when I begin to speak a little bit more about manual mode and aperture and shutter, you know sort of what I'm speaking about. So thanks for watching, and we will hopefully catch you shortly again with something from the field.